choppy, please let me know, because I literally had to find a spot to hide out that wasn't surrounded by noise. So with that being said, thank you so much for allowing me to come before you guys to tell to share my story. As LaJoy mentioned, above all of those things, I am a mother of three, a single mother of three. My oldest son, Tyler, is 13 years old, and he currently attends Inspired Teaching. So far, my experience with his, so Tyler has an IEP, and he's been diagnosed with autism. And so with our distance learning experience, it's been both good and bad. I think that one important thing for me is that now the communication seems to have picked up from the school leadership, whereas when we were physically in the building, it wasn't as consistent. So I'm grateful for that. Kind of sad that it had to be a pandemic that brought us to a better place when it came to communication. But certainly am grateful for where they have picked up. Really, it's just been kind of difficult because I have a kindergartner and I also have a sixth grader, along with a child that has special needs and that is in need of supports. He receives OT services along with speech and language therapy, which are now being given to him via Zoom calls every Wednesday, which is kind of okay for routine, but I'm not really seeing where it's beneficial, because you have children that are inside of the room that are not necessarily on the same level that he is. So the teacher kind of spends more time trying to I guess, get the children to kind of engage and re-engage constantly. And then before you know it, the 30 minutes are gone by. Another hard spot for me has been really to just figure out where, how his IEP goals are measurable during this time. Because I know in a traditional school building, in a traditional setting, what to look for. Generally, I'm not quite sure what I'm looking for. As we go through these times, and it's really critical to me because Tyler is getting ready to transition into ninth grade, and also he's getting ready to deal with a totally different school population, leaderships, teachers, and all of those things. So I'm really just searching for what the plan of action is moving forward as far as engaging parents, because right now I feel really disempowered. Because I'm not having those conversations with leadership. And then also knowing that Tyler really wasn't receiving the services, I'm certainly worried about where he will be academically as far as entering ninth grade. And that's really, without getting really drawn out, has been my experience with the distance learning.
Well, first of all, blessings to you and the three boys. It's not easy being a single mom. I'm a single mom, and it's not easy, balancing that. So first of all, don't feel disempowered. There was power right there in your truth, and that's all we can do right now is to share our stories and to share our truth. So we love you. All right. And next, we are going to go to Miss Parrish. I love Miss Parrish. Miss Parrish, first of all, before I get into your intro, I'm loving the rap, ma'am.
You should see the hair under here.
I'm loving the rap queen vibes. I'm absolutely loving it. All right, folks. Miss Parrish, first of all, she is an amazing mom of two. She's a Ward 5 parent. She's on the Thrive by 5 coordinating council with me as a parent member. She's a disability advocate. And I think most of all, she's an amazing chef. So I'm gonna need you to send me some food in the mail. Miss Parrish, the floor is yours. I'm gonna mute myself.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, LaJoy and friends at AJE and friends in the community. I appreciate the opportunity to share my experience. What Yolanda Corbett said resonates deeply with me. I could almost say what she said, and then I can close because it really is, I think, a common thread that we're experiencing as families of students with disabilities. I have two. I have one in first grade and one in kindergarten. So having two children in distance learning at the exact same time of the day who both need support is really an interesting challenge. I never thought I would move so much in my house in one day ever in my life. But it's been a very revealing experience as well. And I would say that we've had an opportunity to really learn. And my son's IEP, my son has multiple unspecified disabilities, unspecified anxiety, some form of ASD as well as ADHD. And his main thing is the necessity to have a dedicated aide to help him facilitate his day. He also receives other supports and services in the school, such as OT and other therapies that they have offered to maintain. But as Ms. Corbett said, it is extremely difficult for them to maintain those types of services. Specifically when families are also working. Many families, we're both home. His dad and I are both home, but we're both also working full time. And we both also have jobs that have COVID-19 priority responsibilities. And so we're having to prioritize and balance, and it's extremely difficult. A few things that we found that are challenges, because there have been bright sides too. I do want to acknowledge there have been some really great bright sides to this. The challenges that we've seen are very similar to what Ms. Corbett said. No individualization of the plans is extremely difficult for the IEP to be implemented the way it's intended to be individualized for the student in this type of setting. There's no way to pull out, move over, provide a support, or do anything like that during the academic learning time. My son operates at a different level of learning than many of his classmates in his self-contained classroom. So that dedicated aid supports so he can have individualized instruction is extremely critical, and he can't get that right now. And it is actually kind of winding up a little bit more of the anxiety issues and presenting new challenges. The goals are immeasurable. The goals in his IEP are specific to the school building, and it is very difficult for those IEP goals to be actually measured or monitored, though the school would like to suggest that it can be, but it can't. And then the services that are being provided, while being provided, is very disjointed. And so the schools are able to check that box. It is definitely very disjointed. I can say that my children both attend Bridges Public Charter School, and the school, it's clear to them the challenge too. And it is not lost on them that it's difficult for everyone. And so they've been extremely flexible in working with us as a family. And so that part is great. On the bright side, I've been able to really see what my son goes through when he's trying to learn. And so when his IEP came up for exploration and we needed to have a meeting, it was much easier for me to speak on his behalf because I have spent weeks with him that I wouldn't have been able to spend with him if he had not been home with me trying to learn. If I wasn't able to actually have a real view into what really sets off his anxiety and what subjects give him struggle and how long does it really take him to finish a task. And I was able to have a very deep and meaningful conversation toward the IEP and the designation of his disability. Being able to speak on his behalf. I would not have been able to do that had it not been for this situation. So I will say that while it has presented challenges, and I got to tell you, I can't wait till March 29th comes and we can move on. I am so pleased to have been able to learn that aspect and speak on his behalf, and really be able to produce a meaningful revision to his IEP that I think will be more effective in the fall. I do have concerns about trying to make sure that he can you keep learning. This particular drop in going to school is going to make summer different. It's going to make the summer break feel like it lasted forever. And so I do think that it would be great for families with students in this type of in these categories of special needs if they were able to have some type of learning support package or materials or anything that a family could continue to use throughout the summer to make the transition into the next grade into the fall a little bit smoother. I think that transition into the fall is going to be tough. And I also think that if students are moving forward in grade, it may be tough to transition to the expectations of the next grade. So while there's been some challenges, I definitely think there's been some upsides too.
Well, first of all, I think all of us are probably just amazed at you and your brilliance, Ms. Parrish. So thank you so much for sharing. It's important that we, keep uplifting these stories because it is a challenge, navigating special education on a normal basis. So navigating it in this setting is a challenge, and we're just going to get through it together. And so, Scott, I believe I'm going to throw the ball to you so you can introduce the teacher perspective. Am I right?
Yes. So
Yes.
thank you, LaJoy, and thank you to our parents. Really great to get that perspective about how this is happening at home. And so we want to hear from our educators now. So that's why we're so happy to do this with AJE, and we can really hear both that perspective from parents and also on the educator end, how we're trying to implement this work and care for our students with disabilities. So we're going to hear first from Megan Callahan, who is an educator at Garfield Elementary School. Megan, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. This is a really important conversation that we're having, especially to hear from the parent perspective and teacher perspective and just everyone who's involved in these students' lives. So I teach 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade at Garfield Prep. I am a self-contained teacher in the Communication and Education Supports classroom. So it's me as the lead educator, and I work with 2 amazing paraprofessionals, and all of my students have full-time IEPs. So I just want to share a little bit about some things that I feel too as a teacher, and about what distance learning is like for me and for my students and their families. So before COVID-19, a day in the life of my students would be very predictable. We have a consistent routine and schedule that students would know, and so they would be able to prepare for. We would start our day with breakfast in the classroom, a morning meeting, and then jump right into our academic instruction. As many of you know from the parent and educator side, in special education, a lot of our instruction is individualized and is in small groups and through centers-based instruction. And that was no different in my classroom. So we would practice our reading and math skills, rotating through 4 small groups with 3 different educators, using a lot of high quality interventions. Unfortunately, that is really hard to do during distance learning. We can use a lot of high quality technology tools, Zoom and their breakout rooms, or Microsoft Teams, and teachers have been so innovative in the way that they use those tools, but it doesn't replace that small group instruction in person. And especially when we're providing students with a lot of like visual prompts or verbal prompts, that's really hard to do over video. And so it sort of forces us to be a little more innovative in our approach. Some things that have worked for me and I think have been really helpful for my families is every day I host a live classroom meeting using Microsoft Teams, and my students are invited to join. They can use their video, they cannot, but that's our time to really continue building our classroom community and practice some of our social skills, and also just work on our own wellness and self-care. So that's when we do our mindfulness strategies and sort of like set our intent for the day. And I found that this has been a really useful check-in time with students just to see how they're doing, how I can support them, and also how we can work together from the educator and family side to meet the students' needs. While this has been great, it has been challenging to assess students' IEP goals. I will be the first one to admit that. And I think one thing that has been really helpful is being flexible to meet the parents' needs and the students' needs. And the way that I've found that's worked for my students and their families is scheduling one-on-one sessions at least once a week, all the way up to 3 times a week. And I do these mostly through videos And this has been really helpful for me as an educator to get some of that data and see where they are with their IEP goals and with other academic and social emotional needs. But that has been one way that I've been able to check in with my students and their families. There's a lot of differences between in-person instruction and distance learning. We all know that and we all feel that. One way that it is hard for a lot of students with disabilities is if they have a behavior plan, or if we have to implement those supports or one-on-one aid, it might not be possible. And that's something that I feel like we really need to prioritize in this time and in the fall as we transition back to school. How are we going to provide those supports? I really believe that all of our families in the district are really strong and resilient. And so that's why these conversations are so valuable. That's my perspective as a special educator. The biggest thing that I've learned is flexibility as an educator, to really ask my students and their families what they need, and then how I can support that so we can move them toward their academic and social goals even during this hard time. Thanks, Scott. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that perspective and all that you're doing for students right now. I'm going to turn it over to someone with a slightly different perspective, a member of our EmpowerEd Teacher Council and special inclusion coordinator at Mundo Verde Public Charter School, Giselle Estrada.
Hey, so special ed coordinator, that works too. It's really exciting to see everyone on here. I'm so pleased to see how many folks we have joining us today. Yeah, so like Scott said, I have a slightly different perspective because I'm not actively working with students on a day-to-day basis anymore. I was previously in the classroom, obviously. This is my first year stepping out, so it's been interesting. So I kind of polled some of the teachers that I worked with because I really wanted to hear from them what has been some of the pluses and deltas for them. And so a lot of them shared the flexibility in scheduling instructional sessions and small group sessions has been somewhat of a plus for them, really just coordinating with families for the time that works best for them. On the flip side of that, though, it's been difficult for some of them to even make initial contact with some families, right? So the digital divide is definitely being highlighted in some sense. The use of technology to present videos, games, visuals, even math websites or apps that are engaging and accessible to some students has been a plus. Let's see. So for a number of our students, actually, during this distance learning time, it's been found or seen that they are actually doing better. For some of our students who had a really difficult time in school behaviorally, attention-wise or sensory-wise, the comfort of being at home has actually been beneficial for them, being in a comfortable environment. However, that's not true for all of our students, because we definitely have some students who are in more challenging home situations, right? Who don't have the luxury of a quiet space to like really focus, right? So I've heard that some of our students are having to like go into the bathroom, right? Just to find like a quiet space to attend to the class. I think one of the challenges also is that this has been a really difficult emotional time for everybody involved, right? So really, the teachers are having to balance their work life, and that's been difficult for some of them because some of them are actually working harder than they were in the building, because now there isn't that sort of definite cutoff time, so they find themselves working into the wee hours of the night, and they're not really giving themselves the time to practice the self-care that they need in order to be as emotionally ready or present for the students that they're seeing. Let's see what else. Sorry, guys, I have notes also. Somebody mentioned notes earlier. I think it was you, LaJoy. So one thing is that, and I heard, Michelle, you said earlier, a challenge that has come up as far as like the dedicated aides. I just want to shout out some of our schools who have really commissioned our dedicated aides to like continue to work with the students. So for us in Mundo Verde, we have our dedicated aides logging on with their student that they're assigned to for either the whole group or the small group or the one-to-one sessions that they're having with our teachers, and still continuing that interaction and that relationship that they have with their students and with the families. I think one of the challenges or the things that we will have to think about as we transition back to school, like the actual physical building, is really, I have a psychology background, so I'm also always thinking from like a mental health perspective. Socio-emotionally, like what is that going to look like for our students, right? After spending all of these months at home, what is it going to look like for them to now have to leave, in some instances, a place of sanctuary or comfort and go back into an environment that may, invoke a lot of anxiety or a lot of other challenges for them. So that's something that we definitely have to consider. Hopefully that answered your question, Scott.
Absolutely. Thanks, Giselle. And so thanks to all of you for providing those different perspectives that are all really valuable as parents and educators who are also parents, which is a special challenge these days. So I'm gonna turn it over to Maria to discuss a little bit about, very briefly, just the policy and law aspects of this before we get into a broader conversation and open this up. I just wanted to point out too, this dedicated aid thing has been pointed out a couple of times. I mean, it is one of the things I think we need to think about in terms of recovery. There's going to be a need for more educators if we need to be in smaller class sizes, or we're taking shifts. And for some schools who are not able to do that, whether that's constraints because they're a small school or their buildings themselves, to make sure that for special education, for our English language learners and others, that we don't end up using all of our dedicated aids that are really needed for these students just to split classes, to make smaller class sizes. And, I think so it's really important to make sure the services that are provided for special education, for ELL and other things, that really are dedicated to those things, especially when they're going to need it even more, right, in this time in recovery. And so I think an important thing for us to watch out for. So I'll turn it over to Maria for a little background on the policy.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to send in the chat some links so that you guys don't get stuck watching a lot of words on your screen, so you have it. But I think the first thing to remember as we enter into this space and think about what the law is and what we're doing now is that the law at its core is still the law. It hasn't really changed. The obligation of LEAs is still to provide kids with a free, appropriate public education. The federal government and the states have done a good job of providing some guidance about what that looks like and what we need to do navigating moving forward. And I think for most people, the thing to remember is that there is an obligation to engage in the best faith efforts now that one can, but there's also an acceptance and a reality. And I think that the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, and also OSSI have been very clear in communicating to school districts and families that we might not be hitting FAPE right now. We need to try to hit FAPE, that is our obligation, but we might not get there right now. And I think the permission that OSEP and OSSI have given schools and families to work together to figure out what compensatory education or missed services plans might be is, I think, in the long term, going to be a great space for all of us to collaborate and do some different things and think creatively about what we're doing in special education and how we're measuring student success. In the chat, I put around I've shared a blog post from AJE that has all of the federal guidance, a link to all of OSCE's guidance, and some webinars that OSCE have put out about accessibility. I'm sorry, that OSEP and OCR put out about website accessibility and content accessibility. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm not going to go through all of that in great detail right now. But I think the two things to really remember are that the law is still the law. You know, nothing changed. There's not some magical, we don't do FAPE right now. None of that's happening. We all have the same obligations that we've always had. And if we are not getting to where we need to be, just like we have always had to do, we need to have a conversation and figure out how we're going to get our kids where they need to go. So I just want to be really clear that my little section of the policy brief is super underwhelming. This is the same framework we've all worked in for all these years. And we know how to do this. We know how to be creative. And we know how to make student-centered decisions and come up with student-centered solutions. I also want to flag for you, I know there's been some talk about the federal guidance and, oh my gosh, in the CARES Act, IDEA might have many, many waivers. None of that happened. IDEA is still IDEA. There aren't timeline waivers or anything like that. The only waiver that was requested, and I think will be granted and probably should be granted, is for pre-K kids transitioning from IDEA Part C to Part B, to make sure our 3-year-olds, when they turn 3, don't suddenly lose services. That's it. So the law is still the law, and there hasn't been any significant change there. Like I said, everything is in there. I'm not going to bore you to death with it. And I do think the OSCE guidance can be helpful in how you frame things in conversations with your families, especially the Q&A. And I'll pull that one out and put in the link as well. Okay.
Maria, I already did it. It's in the chat box, everybody. Q&A.
Thank you.
All right, LaJoy is going to kick us off now as we open this for a little bit of open conversation. We'll throw out a couple questions. We'll do a couple polls, and we just want to encourage people to both to use the chat and to get into our conversation. LaJoy?
Yes, thank you, Scott. I love the teamwork frame that we have going on here in the Zoom. This is lovely. So I think the first question, you know, that we all thought about, you know, at EmpowerEd and at AJE, and just from what we're hearing in the community is, and this is open to everyone, but especially our families, and I have my notes here, so y'all excuse me, what resources or support do families of students with disabilities need to be successful during distance learning? Now, I have my personal truth. I'm gonna keep that to myself. I can chime in if y'all need me to, but I would love for all of us to hear, you know, like what resources or support do you think families of kids with disabilities need during this time?
So feel free to unmute and jump in, or just say put your name in the chat and that you would like to jump in, and LaJoy can call on folks.
Hey, LaJoy, this is Michelle Parrish.
Yeah, go ahead. Please, go ahead, please.
I'm a chatterbox, so always have something to say. You know, I think it's an interesting question you asked that, because I don't think that there is a bucket answer. I think that the support has to be individualized, and I don't know. I've read in the chat where I do see that some schools are going to great lengths to try to provide services and support and work with families of variable schedules and things of that nature. And I think that's amazing that that's happening. But I think that the main thing that families really need is that individualized support based on their household. I think that the distance learning, the IEPs need to be remodeled to actually match the household, the schedule of the house, the needs of the working parents, possibly if the parents have become suddenly unemployed, and then there's new household stress and other issues that might actually be presenting digital divide issues with internet and technology, and even when you are able to get that technology provided, getting it set up, finding a place to sit, you know, the distractions in the home. I know that my son's teacher wanted us to It's to move away from distractions, but we're at home. It's like it's very difficult to move away from distractions, and not everybody has large homes that they can move and cordon off spaces. And so I do think that when we talk about how do we support families with special needs students, or really any student through this process, how do we support them? We have to do that at the individual per family level, where we're actually finding out what a family actually needs, what are their constraints, what are their limitations, and how it will work best. And I know that that's very challenging for a school to do that when you maybe have one main teacher in a self-contained and maybe two other supports and dedicated aid. I know that's very difficult, and there's a lot of burden on that lead teacher to maintain the needs of each student. But the only way to really address it is to look at what an individual family needs. There really isn't, in my opinion, that is a one-size-fits-all type of solution. It has to be individualized, as is the intent really of the IEP.
Exactly. And Ms. Parrish, I don't know if you can see the chat box. I'm not sure, but it lit up. People are, definitely in agreement with you. And I think, something that we say at AJE is, during this pandemic and when this pandemic is over, we really have to meet families where they are. That's just the reality of now. And that's just the reality of, of where we're going to be. Maria, I know you said something in the chat box to answer to that too. So I'm gonna kick it to you for a second and then we'll go back.
So I know, I'm sure Julie and some of my colleagues who talk to me a lot are going to not be surprised by what I'm about to say. One wonderful tool that IDEA has within it is parent training as a related service. This is a wildly underused tool in our toolbox. IDEA allows schools to put on a child's IEP training for the parent. So the parent knows how to support some of these interventions at home, so the parent can support ABA, so the parent can support what you're trying to do, and you have time and support, and it's in the IEP where you can support the family in a very concrete way. That was underused before the crisis, and now that we have this crisis, I think the fact that it's been underused is just hugely apparent. It's particularly helpful for occupational therapy and for other targeted therapies as well. But that's all. I'll get off that soapbox.
No, it's not a soapbox. That's not a soapbox. It's real. And I think, this is something that we all need to hear because maybe somebody didn't know, and now we know. A lot of folks may not, know that. I honestly, for my personal truth, I actually didn't know that before I got to AJE. Like I was just going to stuff because I'm like, all right, got a braid here. I need to be able to help advocate for her. So that's real.
When Maria said that, my mind just kind of exploded. Like, what? Because I have to tell you that continues to be the missing thread, not just now, but all the time. That is the missing link. It's fascinating. I wrote that down.
And I
love you, Ms. Parrish. Anybody else? Can y'all just jump in?
Yeah, I was just gonna talk a little more about the parent training while schools are thinking or considering planning training, just based on the feedback as we're seeing with the distance learning, having a one-time fits all for parents is not always likely for our parents. So offering it at multiple times of the day, so parents can engage in a meaningful way, and they don't have to decide whether they want to come to training or go to work so that they can take care of their family. So it's just making sure that we are taking this lesson from distance learning, that we take that back into school when we're thinking about recovery, because it's some of the same challenges would be there for families, and it's vital that they have this level of support.
Yes. All right. Anybody else before I hand it back to Scott? I believe, right, Scott? All right. I'm loving the chat box.
Yeah, please keep the chat going. I'm going to throw out another question, kind of geared towards our educators and people who are working in schools, which is how is the relationship between special educators and general educators changed during this time? Needing to do that communication and coordination and planning virtually. Anybody want to jump in on that relationship?
And if you guys don't volunteer, I'm gonna call on you.
Hi. I would say that the relationship between our special education teachers and our general education teachers are just as strong. The general education teachers at Apple Tree, actually, when they do their morning meetings, the special education teachers participate in that, as well as they lesson plan together in order to differentiate for their students, for our special education students. And even with that information, they're also able to, when they do their individualized instruction, that they're able to support them with whatever happened in.
Cerré la puerta del baño, Luis. Tengo frío.
Sorry. Go ahead.
That they're able to support them on the general education side. So whatever the lesson or the theme was, then they also can differentiate that when they do the individualized. So I will have to say that the collaboration is continuing and the lesson planning is continuing. And even with our dedicated aides and our teacher assistants as well, they're all just a part of that.
That's great. And I'm seeing in the chat a lot of folks saying basically unchanged, that that people are really maintaining relationships, and educators are so adaptable, and there's been so much incredible just innovation and ways of continuing the supports that they provide for families and students during this time. Anybody else want to talk about that relationship? Seeing a lot of folks agree there. All right, LaJoy is going to ask us a little bit more about that, the structures and safeguards that we can put in place.
Yes, all right, thank you, Scott. So the next question that I wanted to pose to all of us, and this is a challenging question, so I'm going to challenge all of us to dig deep and to think of this as a learning moment. This is not to throw stones or to point fingers, but for us to learn about this together. So to my parents, to our school leaders and our educators, how are we missing the mark with distance learning so far with students with disabilities? And I know that's a challenging question, and I ask that we dig deep because I also feel like that question kind of poses to what was going on before the pandemic happened. So maybe I'm gonna expand it a little bit. How were we missing the mark before? And how are we missing the mark now? So it's open. Don't make me call on you.
I think, so I work at a non-public school. So we actually educate kids from DC and Maryland. So I saw it from a different perspective, given that we had multiple states that we were trying to adhere to during this time. And one of the things that I think OSSI really missed the mark on was just like how long it took before any guidance came out. So Maryland hit the ground running. We had meetings consistently, and we had exemplar, here's what's expected. So we were able to get all of our DC students really benefited from that immediate head start of guidance that came later for DC. And then some of the things for DC, we were like, well, we've already started this, so we're not gonna really take this guidance, but some of it did also help to supplement and really build up for the kids. And I think one of the things that DC did well is even though they may have come off and said, okay, nope, we're not going to do related services, later on they were like, okay, no, we are going to accommodate, and ultimately realized the best thing we can do is make sure that the kids have access to as much as possible, which really made it great for our kids because their related services are a huge portion of their IEP, and missing out on that speech or the OT, that's really what's helping that parent with these behaviors, is learning these sensory strategies at home, being able to implement it. So I really appreciated that, whether, going right off the bat and saying no, but then being able to say, no, we want to make sure the kids get what they need.
Thank you, Abby. That was wonderful. Anybody else would love to chime in? I'm seeing the chat box. I kind of want to call on Julie.
I'd like to jump in.
Oh, hey, Ben, please.
Yeah, so one area that I think has been really difficult and also really interesting to watch is initial eligibilities. We always see kind of a rush towards the end of the year with initial. It hasn't really changed. One thing I think that DCPS got correct, which I really appreciated, was telling teachers to kind of, if an initial eligibility needed in-person assessments, to let that stay open so that it wasn't just closed out, and then the student might, go to a new school and not get evaluated, or the parent might have to, advocate for a new evaluation if there's a new teacher, and then, you just go time without initial services. But I think where we really dropped the ball was that they also have ingrained in special education teachers like timeliness and impact, and we haven't had an update on impact. So there's been a real big like, hey, you should keep things open and let them expire, which I think is like a really great way to keep it open, but then teachers are afraid to do that. So that's where I think there's been a big disconnect. Hopefully we'll learn more on Friday that anything that goes over won't be a problem, but that's something we're seeing play out in my school.
Thank you so much for that.
LaJoy, this is Michelle. I do think that
Michelle,
that one of the things that I piggybacking on what Ben was saying, I have seen like a sort of a gift and a curse kind of situation with the new eligibilities, because families that are being introduced to it for the very first time, this is an extremely difficult time for a family to be introduced to the process, to the law. Most families, for the first time it's introduced, have no sense of what the law is, don't know to talk to an advocate, don't know what to read, how to research, don't know the language. And so what I'm finding as I speak to parents in Ward 5 who are getting requests for new eligibility, they're concerned, they're confused, they don't know how to talk about it, and they feel particularly, let's say, railroaded, if you will. They don't know if they're what to say, and they don't know how to have the conversation. And I think having this conversation in a distance environment where in many cases not everybody's on the camera, it's not in person, you can't really necessarily pick up the cues and understand. And there's so much, I think, that if there was a way for the city, for OSSEO, the district as a whole, to have potentially modified that process in a way, or maybe held on the new eligibilities, so that so families would have at least the opportunity to have a better, more guided conversation. Because what I am hearing is that families are very concerned, confused, and they don't necessarily know what to do. And they feel a sense of duress as it relates to moving forward into the next school year without completing the documentation. So I definitely see that out there.
yeah, and just for everyone to know, and then I'm gonna bring it back to Scott. If you all have families that are just confused and are just really struggling trying to navigate it, please, I think Maria or Rashonda, can someone put this in the chat? They can, the AJE is the federal designated parent training information center. So please reach out to us, because that's what we're here to help. And then Scott, I'm gonna kick it back to you. You're like on my left. Wait, yes, you're on my left. So I'm like,
Thanks, LaJoy. So I'm going to throw out one more question before we finish, but I'm also going to put a poll up on the screen. We just want to kind of get a pulse of everyone in here about a couple of things. One is we're going to talk at the end here just about that transition back to school. So the poll is going to ask a couple of things. One, about what supports we need to provide in maybe students with disabilities going back to school early, and if we should prioritize that in terms of physical learning, if we can't have everyone go back, and then also who would feel comfortable sending students back if we don't have a vaccine yet, but there's some physical in-person learning happening. So I'm going to throw up this poll and allow everyone to answer that. And then I'm also going to throw out this question to discuss, which is what structures and safeguards do we need to have in place for a successful transition back to school to in-school based learning. So if anybody wants to contribute to that, what kind of structures and safeguards do we need to be able to go back in person, especially for our students with disabilities?
Scott, as we look at that poll, I think one thing that is so interesting is that for a lot of our kids with disabilities, they're going to want to be either first back in the building, but also sometimes last back in the building, depending on the nature of their disability. So it's really going to be a very tricky thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, we've heard so much is, right, this is all about individualization, knowing the families, as you said, training the parents. So very understandable to see a lot of depends.
You're all becoming lawyers. Your answer is going to be, it depends.
And also, Scott, can I chime in?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about, just Abria, and Abria has chronic lung disease, which is a respiratory issue, and we're talking about a respiratory virus. And I think just one of the biggest thing that I would really want to see is those schools need to be fully staffed with nurses. Just fully staffed to no end, maybe even two, just to make sure that, our kids that do, have these like medical and health challenges, that they are protected. Because I think, me personally, in my truth, I'm just really, if the mayor was like, okay, we're gonna open school, like, I'm just making this up, like a month or two from now, I would be like, like a little nervous with her, with her health concerns.
Totally. And, I saw that question there. Is there a chance we'll be going back to distance learning in the fall? Is that discussed in the proposal? And I'll say just the teacher created education recovery plan that EmpowerEd put out. One of the things we said as a precondition is that there needs to be a full-time nurse in every school, and that we're a long way away from that. We don't have that at all right now. And if we don't have someone who can respond to health concerns immediately in every school, that's going to increase anxiety, right, about sending children to school. So the nurses are really important, and just what health infrastructure we have. And it speaks to the importance of community schools too, where we have community schools that do have Mary Center, for example, in the building, or other health providers, and how much of a comfort that's probably going to be in those schools going back. And maybe that'll give us a chance to advocate for and expand that kind of model. Anyone else want to jump in on this question?
I know one of the things we have already been kind of discussing is actually a blended learning model when the school year starts. So does it make sense? Can you practice social distancing with all your kids in the school? No, you can't even practice it with all the kids in a classroom most of the time. So what would it look like if we did, like, one day these classrooms are going to be in school, then on Tuesdays this classroom, Wednesdays this classroom, and when you're not in school, then you're back virtual learning, so that all the kids are still getting that social and growth with their peers, but also having that time with kids with disabilities who really need that face-to-face time and are not thriving in the online environment. They may be coming back on both Monday and Wednesday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, versus some of their general ed peers may only have one day, which with us, we don't have any gen ed kids, but we work with charter schools as well, and that was some of the discussions that we've been having around that.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more person before we close out, if anybody else has a desire to jump in.
Hi.
Hi.
This is Carlene Reed. So great conversations all around. I know someone mentioned about budget advocacy related to students with special needs, and something to consider in your testimonies is I know speaking with St. Cloud of Greater Washington, and I believe River Terrace will also be impacted. They used to receive some grants to kind of buffer the services versus just getting the per pupil funding. And those have been diminished over the years. Basically, there could possibly be an impact in the sense of those schools not receiving funding, adequate funding to provide students' needs. So that's one area people can consider in their budget advocacy, considering St. Colette and River Terrace, and bringing back those grants that supported that. And then for future conversations, I would really love to hear about English language learners as well. That's something that even looking on the federal side, hardly any guidance has been brought out about English language learners. So good conversations, I really enjoyed it, but just throwing those two things out there.
Thanks, Carlene. That's a great suggestion. And EmpowerEd's main initiative, this past year was our Latinx Educators Present Day campaign. And so that's definitely a great idea to think about bringing in folks who have been active in that and others to have a conversation specifically about our English language learners. And so maybe that's a future town hall to come here. I want to thank everybody for their participation and just close with some notes on advocacy and next steps we can take. So the first thing, I'm going to drop a couple things into the chat, is if you go to the, what I just put in there, the weareempowered.org/recovery, you can take a look at the teacher-created education recovery plan that we put out. And it's supposed to be a living document. It's never in PDF form. It's still in Google Docs so that we can keep adding to it as people give us feedback, and we have changed it already several times. We're going to be adding more about early childhood soon. After this conversation, we want to add more about special education and students with disabilities. So we'll take the notes from this conversation and add more to that. If you have suggestions, please send it to us there. But another point of advocacy is the budget's going to come out probably Friday or Monday now from the mayor. The council members should hear from us about what our students with disabilities need and their families and our educators, and the investments we're going to need, especially in staffing, probably, given the realities of having some combination of distance learning and in-person learning for some time. So that's really important. And I want to just put it here. We have a petition that I'm going to, that might not have linked well. Let me try it again. But we have a petition that we just put out, which is to open the hearings. The hearings right now are only by invitation, and we really think the public should have a chance to weigh in on the DC education budget. So we have a petition just to open those hearings, to democratize them, to allow people to give testimony, and really enhance the experience in a virtual way. I'm not sure if that works, but if someone can let me know if they clicked on the link and were able to get through there. If not, I'll try to post again. But I want to thank everybody so much for jumping on and for taking part in this, and all your advocacy and all your work every day with students and families. And I'll turn it over to Maria for a final word from AJE.
All right, wonderful. Well, again, thank you very much for letting us be here. I appreciate it. I appreciate the chance to talk to so many folks, and I really appreciate so many people giving me warm fuzzies about parent training. You've brought joy to my heart. Please do, we are still open, and if you have families who are confused and don't know, what their next steps are, we're taking calls. It's just roll into my voicemail at home. So I still pick up, LaJoy picks up. And please do continue to send families our way. And we are having online trainings for families. It's all on the website, and I'm sure most of you will get a blast email very soon about it. But again, thank you. And it was really good to hear the conversation between families and educators. That gives me a lot of hope. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.